Hello, welcome to UGC EPG Pathshala Learning Sessions. I am Dr. Poonam Sharma, Associate Professor, Department of Geography, Shaheed Bhagat Singh College, University of Delhi. Today, I am going to discuss a module of disaster management, and the topic of today's module is post-disaster needs assessment. Post-disaster needs assessment is the process of assessing the intensity and impacts of disaster and the need of disaster recovery. It is essential to understand the process and methodology associated to develop the effective post-disaster assessment document. The chapter elaborates on the process of post-disaster needs assessment, its necessity, implications. It will also be reflected on the process of post-disaster needs assessment adapted in India. The objectives of learning for this chapter includes to comprehend the necessity and implications of post-disaster needs assessment, to understand the process of post-disaster need assessment in India. Now, I am going to explain you about the post-disaster needs assessment PDNA and how the word is defined. Post-disaster needs assessment PDNA is a comprehensive exercise to collect information on the social, economic and environmental impact of disasters on key sectors. Based on the detailed assessments, the recovery needs of the affected population are identified. A single consolidated report of the assessment serves as the primary document for developing a comprehensive recovery framework. It consists of the long-term and the short-term recovery strategy and outlines the design and implementation plans. This document serves as the backbone to identify how to build back what is lost while incorporating build back better principles. The document also serves as the baseline for engaging a discussion with international developmental agencies to secure external assistance. World Bank or other donors can also be approached leveraging the document to provide assistance in targeted sectors or to request for additional assistance. It minimizes replication of efforts and partial information by putting forth a comprehensive document collecting multi-sectorial inputs. Thus, PDNA provides a comprehensive and dependable basis to plan recovery and reconstruction and provides systematic guidelines to link disaster recovery and reconstruction efforts to sustainable development. Now, let's look into the history of evolution. Till mid-20th century, due to infrequent occurrence of disasters, the loss and damage were estimated by government based on reconstruction cost of physical assets like buildings, highways, etc. Little or no attention was paid to social and human development aspects in these estimations. In 1965, the UN General Assembly adopted the decision to help disaster-stricken people, and by 1970s, the worldwide concern to assist disaster-affected population increased. The United Nations Disaster Relief Organization defined the broad conceptual framework for assessing disaster impact and effects. After 1972 earthquake in Nicaragua, the UNELCAC, United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America, conducted the first comprehensive assessment of disaster impact, which estimated economic value of lost assets and the indirect economic damages. It also helped the Nicaraguan government in preparing the economic recovery and reconstruction plan. This methodology was thus standardized and the first published in 1991 as the DALA methodology. It was further modified to include disaster impact in environment. This extended methodology was published in 2003. In 2006, the decision to adopt UNECLAC along with the needs assessment efforts to identify the household personal level impact was taken internationally for standardization. Also, the requirement to quantify the estimation of financial requirements for recovery and reconstruction across various sectors of the socio-economic activities was identified. Additional mechanisms to enable systematic estimation of recovery needs were identified. Recovery needs were to be systematically estimated to ensure restoration of personal income, availability of minimum level of basic services, including education, health, nutrition, transportation, water, sanitation, electricity, etc. And the very important recovery of production level in agriculture, livestock, fishery, manufacturing, commerce, tourism, mining and other areas. The GFDRR produced the guidance note on the application of expanded UNECLAC methodology and recovery needs framework. Under the Hyogo framework for action, the scope of assessment to identify disaster impact and effects to estimate the financial requirement of post-disaster recovery and reconstruction was agreed for signing in 2008. The tripartite agreement between heads of the European Commissions, the World Bank and United Nations Development Group. Apart from this, many countries have on their own developed and followed a methodology to conduct their losses and damage assessment. After the year 2007, the process of PDNA gained momentum and popularity across the world. Many of the affected nations started utilizing PDNA. The countries which includes Bangladesh, Cambodia, Indonesia, Myanmar, Nepal, Cambodia, El Salvador, Haiti, Yemen, Senegal, Namibia, Philippines, etc. In India, after 2001 Gujarat earthquake, the World Bank and other international agencies assisted in conducting disaster impact recovery and reconstruction assessment, which partially adopted the UNECLAC methodology. During the Indian Ocean tsunami and the cyclones in Odisha, the PDNA was developed and applied. Now, let's look into the necessity of post-disaster needs assessment. This PDNA is highly necessary. Why? Number one, to identify the human and socio-economic impact of disaster, the assessment of the following sectors may be carried out: human loss, injured and other affected, including displaced, infrastructure loss, transport, electricity, communication, etc., social sector impact, food, security, nutrition, health and education, cross-cutting issues like livelihood security, access of social benefit schemes and services, to determine the recovery and reconstruction needs, to develop the recovery framework by prioritizing recovery and reconstruction needs. Let us understand the Syndai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction and PDNA. Cross-cutting issues like livelihood security, access to social benefit schemes and services. To determine the recovery and reconstruction needs, to develop the recovery framework by prioritizing recovery and reconstruction needs. Now, let us understand the Syndai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction and PDNA. The SFDRR adopted in 2015 consists of 7 global targets and 4 priorities of action. The first 4 targets are: substantially reduce global disaster mortality by 2030, aiming to lower average per 1 lakh global mortality rate in the decade 2020 to 30 compared to the period 2005 to 2015. Substantially reduce the number of affected people globally by 2030, aiming to lower the average global figure per 1 lakh in the decade 2020-30 as compared to 2005-15. Reduced direct disaster economic loss in relation to global gross domestic product by 2030. Substantially reduced disaster damage to critical infrastructure and disruption of basic services, among them the health and education facilities, including through developing their resilience by 2030. All the above mentioned targets aim at minimizing global disaster impact. To understand the current status and identify the progress, the first necessity is to identify the losses and damage in the form of mortality, morbidity, economic loss, and the loss of critical infrastructure and disruption to basic services that is presently occurring. PDNA provides a consolidated platform to identify the damage and losses. It also helps developing the recovery framework, which prioritizes and guides the recovery and reconstruction needs incorporating DRR principles. It helps in taking a risk-conscious decision while recovery process is undertaken. Additionally, the PDNA process takes into account the 3 key issues highlighted in Syndai Framework: incorporation of the idea to build back better, a step away from working on slices to collaborating in the integrated form based on the comprehensive recovery model, giving due importance to various stakeholders and assigning particular emphasis on the communities. Focus on economic aspects. It takes into account the underlying vulnerabilities, environmental factors, and the community knowledge. Thus, PDNA is an essential instrument which can be utilized to achieve the Syndai Framework priorities. Here, I am going to explain you the methodologies which are followed for post-disaster need assessment. Multiple organizations have issued guidelines for conducting PDNA process. It includes guidelines by GFDRR, UNDP, and ILO. Initiations of PDNA process. How it begins. The PDNA process is initiated after the government request for assistance in conducting the impact assessment of the disaster. The request can come through IAGs as well. Multiple stakeholders at national and global level are informed of the request. A necessary commitment to financially facilitate the PDNA process is made. Often funding requests to international agencies like World Bank, GFDRR is made. The PDNA planning mission sets the goal and identifies the process through which PDNA will be conducted. The local and international experts to conduct the assessments are identified and led by government staff to conduct the assessment. The assessment team is formed based on sectoral experiences. The organization and the management framework to conduct the process is set up. Actors in PDNA process are shown in figure 1. This involves, as depicted in the figure, the different sectors participating in the PDNA process includes PDNA Secretariat, which consists of senior management officials in charge of coordinating the PDNA process, the line ministries and the disaster management authorities of the government involved in the PDNA process, the regional and global development banks, donors and agencies which in some cases are also the financing organizations, civil society, technical and academic institutions, private sectors. Functionally, the 2 core groups that can be identified, which includes PDNA Secretariat. The Secretariat consists of the government as the leading agency and is assisted by the developmental agencies and financial institutions. It collaborates and coordinates the team of experts and conduct the following task. This involves identification and confirmation of the experts on the PDNA team, facilitation of the logistic arrangements and the mission activities, compilation of the baseline data for the PDNA from different ministries and sectors which have been affected or in which the assessment will be carried out. Compilation of the background data required to conduct PDNA, which includes existing assessment reports, maps, flash appeals, etc. Development of standards, field data sheets and other document in consultation with the experts and the team heads are divided into subsectors specific to the different sectoral teams. Review of the output, sectoral assessments and provides the guidance on the compilation of the assessment report. Facilitation of the high-level meeting to present the PDNA report, outcomes, technical experts groups. This is the international, national, regional and local group of experts who carry out the field activity of the assessment. Now look into the tools to conduct PDNA. DALA, Damage and Loss Assessment methodology. This methodology was developed by UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean in the year 1972. Since then, it has been improved and modified with the participation of organizations like WHO, PAHO, World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, UNESCO, ILO, etc. to capture the best approximations of loss and damage in disaster events. It provides the standardized tool for evaluating disaster damages to physical assets, infrastructure, social sectors, capital stocks, etc. and the losses. The methodology is based on economic context of the affected country. DALA follows the quantitative process. It is used to assign a value figure to the damage arising from the hazard, events and disasters. It computes the subsequent economic losses and damages caused by the event. The possible consequences on the national economic growth as well as impact on individual due to livelihood and asset loss are highlighted in the DALA. It follows the mechanism as explained here. The damage considered as the value of physical asset which are totally or partially destroyed, quantifying the losses in the economy due to that happen, the absence or damage of the assets, identification of the impact on macroeconomic performance with a focus on the national GDP. The CBA, Cost Benefit Analysis methodology. This CBA technique is based on the economic principle and is used to organize, appraise and present the cost benefit analysis and trade-offs. Based on the analysis, it identifies the governmental policies and schemes that must be developed, keeping the trade-offs as deciding factors. HAZUS, H-A-Z-U-S, hazards in the USA methodology. HAZUS is an effort by National Institute of Building Sciences (NIBS) to assist FEMA in identifying earthquake loss estimates. It is based on vulnerability assessment approach. The ACM, Advanced Component Method. The ACM methodology was developed by AIR Worldwide Corporation, which followed the objectives of scientific methodology to assess damages by earthquake. CATSIM, Catastrophe Simulation Model. CATSIM model was developed to illustrate the cost-benefit analysis and trade-offs must be taken off to manage economic risks in the anticipation of disasters. It was developed by International Institute of Applied System Analysis. HRNA, Human Recovery Needs Assessment. The HRNA is focused on social impacts of the disaster. It analyzes the impact of disaster on local lifestyle changes induced in lifestyle patterns, institutions, and social structures. It focuses on the households or other units of analysis and considers the data collected at the unit level as primary data. It is based on the perspective developed by analysis. It generates a roadmap for recovery and reconstruction. The roadmap is largely developed using the lens of the affected community and is based on the perspectives of the affected community. The key objectives of conducting HRNA includes revival of livelihoods, restoration of local governance systems, re-establishing community infrastructure, and restoring access to schools and hospitals, cleaning the local environment, providing special assistance to minority and excluded community. The methodology to conduct HRNA process is as explained here. It is based on participatory and consultative process and requires an understanding of the baseline socio-economic context of the surveyed area. Collection of primary data from the field of conducting household individual administration unit level household survey based on predefined questionnaire. It also incorporates interviews with key informations and focus group discussions with the affected community. PDNA methodology is based on the different tools available for assessment. Different organizations developed multiple framework and strategies for assessment. The methodology utilized by GFDRR to develop the PDNA is presented here. Traditionally, the World Bank and IFIS focuses on the damage and loss assessment from an economic perspective. The UN and humanitarian agencies focus on the identification and redressal of human impact and needs. Based on the assessment of damage, loss and needs of PDNA process is developed. The process mentioned by GFDRR consists of the damage and loss assessment, the human recovery needs assessment, and the recovery framework based on the outcomes of DALA and HRNA. The recovery framework is developed. The recovery framework guidelines the process of recovery and it identifies the macro level recovery goals. It summarizes the recovery recommendations from sectoral assessments and it recommends the sectoral assessments and sets of short, medium and long recovery goals at the national level. The PDNA report generally consists of the government-led assessment report, which summarizes the socio-economic impact across different sectors and geographic units. The recovery and reconstruction needs across all sectors identifies and prioritizes the design of the recovery and reconstruction strategies. The policy dialogue between the government and the developmental agencies to initiate the recovery and reconstruction process on a common platform. For example, the PDNA conducted following pre-decided timeline. The PDNA conducted following pre-decided timelines was from the Haiti earthquake. The exercise was conducted during the period for 6 weeks. The disaster occurred on 12th January 2010. The request from government to conduct PDNA was raised 1 week post the event. The draft term for the referral was prepared within 2 weeks of the disaster. The assessment was conducted within 3rd to 5th week. By the 6th week, the draft PDNA report was generated. On October 31st, 2010, the report was presented at the donor conference. As an outcome, the total pledged amount for 2010 to 2013 and beyond added up to $9.9 billion from 59 countries and international organizations. Now, let us learn from a case study. Here is a case study of Nepal PDNA report. In the earthquake that struck Nepal on 25th April and 12th May 2015, nearly 9,000 lives were lost, 500,000 homes were destroyed, sites for important cultural heritage were collapsed, and the economic infrastructure of the nation was brought down, resulting into colossal losses. The PDNA conducted in Nepal after devastating 2015 earthquake was the outcome of exhaustive exercise conducted by National Planning Commission with the assistance for national and international experts and developmental partners in the participatory model. The PDNA was launched to take a stock of the magnitude of devastation, needs and the recovery strategies. It paid specific attention to the inclusion of the marginalized and vulnerable groups while identifying the losses and needs. The sectors reviewed in the PDNA were divided into 4 key sectors: social, productive, infrastructural and cross-cutting. Each sector included the following subsectors, which includes under social sector, housing and human settlements, health and population, nutrition, education, cultural heritage, productive sector, agriculture, irrigation, commerce and industry, tourism, financial sector, infrastructure sector, electricity, communication, community infrastructure, transport, water, sanitation, and hygiene. Cross-cutting sectors include environment and forestry, employment and livelihood, gender and social inclusion, social protection, governance, disaster risk reduction. The macroeconomic impact of the disaster were also identified. The processes involved was, within 3 days of the second earthquake, which occurred on 12th May 2015, Government of Nepal convened meeting with the national and local developmental partners and proposed a PDNA to be undertaken under the leadership of the National Planning Commission. The objective was not only to assess the disaster impact and identify the recovery strategy, but also to identify the funding constraints. The PDNA undertaken followed the methodology developed by EU and the World Bank and the United Nations system. The assessment built on the initial and detailed sectoral damages assessment conducted by the local and central government with the help of developmental partners. The NPC set up the high-level oversight mechanism under the leadership of the Vice Chairman and assisted by the COPE NPC group. Other sectoral heads assumed the lead role of coordinating and guiding the assessment. A distinguished set of advisors were also invited by NPC from Nepal and abroad. The core coordination team consisted of 4 heads of donor agencies, which included ADB, EU, World Bank, JICA, UN, UNDP, and was led by NPC. The core PDNA secretariat was formed by these agencies, and they were provided the daily guidance to the assessment team. A 2-day workshop was conducted to illustrate the methodology, the scope of PDNA. Over 250 government officials and experts and representatives from 30 developmental agencies. 23 thematic groups were formed. A dedicated joint secretary from the relevant linked department, an NPC was assigned to each of these groups. These teams conducted an extensive process involving the data collection, field visits and reports development in the 3 weeks from 22nd May to 10th of June. The assessment were conducted through the coordination of pre-disaster baseline data to compare the post-disaster conditions, the evaluation of disaster effects and the impact of each sector to determine the overall recovery needs and prioritization of the recovery needs by the way of a recovery strategy that suggests appropriate interventions to meet priority recovery. The key findings were presented in the International Conference of Nepal's Reconstruction. Based on the outcome of the study, the following priorities were identified by DRR. Short-term priorities included reconstruction of the damaged sites on reconstruction of the damaged sites on Build Back Better principle, steps to improve the preparedness, response and relief logistics systems, measures to strengthen information and communication capacities, measures to enhance multi-hazard risk monitoring, vulnerability assessment, risk and information dissemination and awareness. Medium to long-term priorities included improvement in legal and institutional arrangements to better address of the goals, to mainstream DRR activities into the developmental sector, particularly housing sector, the public infrastructure, livelihood and social sectors, which means to improve climate change adaptation. Here I will explain post-disaster need assessment in India. Currently, there is no official guideline on the process to conduct PDNA in India. An extensive study by ADPC on PDNA process in India highlights that in India currently the two main types of assessment are conducted. These are disaster response type of assessment. It is developed to estimate the relief accounts that needs to be provided to the disaster affected people based on the SDRF NDRF guidelines. Though it is often considered as a loss assessment, it is primarily the relief assessment conducted by central or state governments in the aftermath of a disaster. In the state level calamities, the loss and damage assessed by the administrative unit level staff are collated and affected are provided with the relief. The Office of the Relief Commissioner in the Revenue Department leads the assessment assisted by the line departments. In case of national level disasters, the relief memorandum is prepared by relief commissioners to the central government and is submitted to the nodal ministry for evaluation and grant of the financial assistance. The content of the relief memorandum varies from state to state and disaster to disaster, but it generally provides the detailed analysis of estimated losses and degree of damage sustained in the disaster. The other point is the post-disaster assessment. In case of severe events, the state authorities often receive support from the developmental agencies like ADB, World Bank, UN to conduct the broader post-disaster need assessment. It aims at estimating the losses beyond the relief assistance and outlines the scope and need of the reconstruction and recovery. This follows a PDNA mechanism elaborated above. The sectors involved in PDNA process in India includes the following: agriculture, forestry and fishing, mining, quarrying and manufacturing, electricity, gas and water resources, water supply, sewerage, waste management, trade, hotels, restaurants, transportation and communication, financing, insurance, real estate and business services, community, social and personal services, the mandate for PRIs and ULBs according to NDMA, capacity building in disaster management for government officials and representatives of Panchayati Raj institutions and urban local bodies at a district level. The guidelines includes for PRIs, preparing immediate agricultural assessment report, assessing the damage to small check dams, surveying blocked waterways, assessing damage to boats, nets, fishes, ponds, etc., assessing the damage to crops, trees in the social forestry land areas, assessing the damage to industrial production, to rural and cottage industries, assessing the damage to houses, assessing the damage to drinking water resources and infrastructure. It is also responsible for the damage of livestock and fodder, assessment of damage to roads and other networks, damage on rural electrification, distribution of electricity, lines and wires, damage to energy sources, damage to critical infrastructure like schools, health centers, hospitals, libraries, etc. Also, the damages to market, public spaces, community assets, and conducting rapid need assessment for PDS needs. Assessing damages to social structures like schools, health centers, hospitals, Anganwadis, etc. Damage to urban biosphere, mortality and morbidity data. Now, let us look into the challenges. A national level guideline or the standard on the methodology and processes to conduct PDNA after a disaster is not currently available. It largely varies according to the methodology undertaken by respective nodal departments. Capacity building and training of the officials to understand the significance of PDNA and conduct the comprehensive PDNA is still missing. Political will and financial support is lacking, thereby PDNA is still not a formal part of post-disaster response recovery framework. PDNA is conducted only in case of severe disasters where external financial aid is received. In the relief assessment mechanism, which is currently prevalent in India, not everyone affected is included to receive assistance. Every sector is often not included in the assessments. Indirect impacts of the disaster are often ignored or partially conducted in the assessment. The assessment is largely focused on relief assistance and focused on recovery or reconstruction assistance is missing. Often, disaster recovery framework is not developed based on PDNA. While concluding the session, the post-disaster need assessment is a government-led and government-owned exercise to collect the information on social, economic and environmental impact of disaster on key sectors. Based on the assessment, the recovery needs of the affected population are identified. PDNA provides a consolidated platform to identify the damage and losses. It also helps to develop recovery framework which prioritize the guidelines and recovery and reconstruction needs incorporating DRR principles and reconstruction needs incorporating DRR principles. It helps in taking a risk conscious decision while recovery process is undertaken. Based on the different tools available for assessment, different organizations developed multiple frameworks and strategies for assessment. A national level guideline or standard on the methodology and process to conduct PDNA after a disaster for India is not currently available. PDNA is conducted only in the case of severe disaster where external financial aid is received. Indirect impact of the disasters are often ignored or partially conducted in the assessment. That's all for today's discussion. I hope the discussion was fruitful and value added your understanding on the PDNA system. Thanks for visiting the site and viewing. Goodbye. See you in the next discussion.